People love stories. From the earliest oral traditions of ancient people to religions to sitcoms, humans love to tell and listen to stories. At the heart of every story is a conflict. One character is butting heads against another character. This butting of heads might be physical, emotional, intellectual, or more often than not, a combination of all three. In the past, the distinction between hero and villain was pretty clear-cut. Snow White and the Evil Queen, Cinderella and her evil family, the good gods versus the evil gods. There's literally an endless number of examples of black and white, clearly defined heroes and villains. Or, to put it even simpler, good guys versus bad guys. But what happens when the bad guys aren't really all that bad? And the good guys, maybe they're not so good either. Or even taking it one step further, what happens when the villains are actually the good guys? The evolution of storytelling has, in many ways, mirrored our own world. In the early days of civilization, there was a very distinct sense of us versus them, our small society versus everyone else, and therefore we, by default, must be the good guys. But as ideologies and schools of thought have grown and evolved over the past 10,000 something years, so too have our ideas of good and evil, hero and villain. A good villain is one that makes you stop and think, makes you wonder if they really are this persona of evil that you're told they are, a so-called sympathetic villain. Take, for example, Roy Batty in Blade Runner. In the world of Blade Runner, replicants were created more or less as slaves to do the work that regular humans didn't want to do or couldn't do. Despite everything people were told and what they chose to believe, we learned that these replicants have emotions, dreams, wants, desires, just like people do. They are, for all intents and purposes, human. They just want to survive, to live what little life was given to them. Now, the way in which Roy Batty goes about sharing his feelings might not be the most productive, but it's telling how a very similar character in pretty similar circumstances could be considered a hero, the good guy. Take a movie like Django Unchained, for example. A slave, rebelling against injustice, getting revenge on those who enslaved him and his family and robbed them of their lives. This is a great example of when a villain could actually be seen as the good guy and the hero, or rather the protagonist, is really just a vessel through which the story is told. I mean, Deckard is just doing his job, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's a good guy. In a similar vein, the early days of comic books gave us the now ubiquitous tropes of good versus evil. Superheroes are good because they're good, and supervillains are bad because, well, of course they are. But recently, we've seen a big rise in this idea of flawed heroes and sympathetic villains. Now, this is particularly true with Batman. In the Fantastic Batman the Animated Series, we get a deeper, more human look at the villains of Gotham City, and how they all had some reason, some gray motivation for what they do and who they are. Mr. Freeze is a great example of a villain who's not really a bad guy. His wife is cryogenically frozen to prevent the cancer from killing her. Someone breaks in, sabotages his experiment, and in the process, wouldn't you know it, mutates him into Mr. Freeze. The entire motivation for his character is to get revenge on this guy who purposely messed everything up and to save his wife. In any other context, Mr. Freeze would be the hero, a good guy, a valiant knight who sets off to slay the dragon and rescue his own personal princess. But because we're told Batman is the hero, the good guy, and Mr. Freeze is the villain, the bad guy, we interpret him as such. But nothing about him is really bad or villain-esque. In fact, it would be pretty interesting to see a Mr. Freeze movie where Batman is kind of the antagonist. Or, if you don't want to do that, change Batman into any random police chief or FBI investigator, and Mr. Freeze would no doubt be seen as the hero. Along the same lines, we have the iconic villain, Magneto. The main crux of the entire X-Men franchise is that humans are afraid of mutants and want them gone. Xavier maintains his unwavering belief that peaceful coexistence is possible, but will require time and patience. Magneto, on the other hand, knows that this is impossible and wants to wipe out regular humans before they can achieve their goal of mutant extinction. Now, in theory, it's easy to see how Magneto is the bad guy in this scenario. His philosophy is to kill before being killed, which is contrasted with Xavier's quest for understanding between the two sides. However, in the movie Logan, we learn that Magneto was right. The backdrop of the movie is that science has wiped out all mutants, except for a tiny select few who have gone into hiding to avoid being hunted and killed. So while Magneto is perhaps a little too enthusiastic in his approach, his entire philosophy is vindicated in Logan. Xavier was wrong, and in fact, because he pushed so hard for peace, he might have inadvertently led to the extinction of his own people. If done skillfully, the line between hero and villain, good and evil, can be blurred in unexpected ways. What happens when no one is good and no one's bad, but it's really just a matter of differing opinion, different points of view on a topic that may or may not actually mean anything anyway? With the world the way it is now, with lines being drawn and labels being thrown around Sunwise and Widdershins, perhaps the line between good and evil isn't as clear-cut as we are all led to believe. Then again, maybe it is. But just because you're told someone is a hero, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are good. And if someone is labeled a villain, it doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't. You know, this kind of idea of like, who's a hero and who's a villain, that kind of thing, like, it's really something I think about a lot, especially nowadays, because like, everyone's arguing about something, right? And everyone thinks that they are correct, that's the point of an argument. But when you really get down to it, oftentimes, not always, there's some very clear-cut cases of like, well, this person is clearly wrong. But oftentimes you get in this argument where it's like, no one's really right or wrong, it's just like, I don't think the way that you think about this certain topic that really might not mean much in the long run anyway. You know, you see these kind of arguments all the time. But especially nowadays where there's kind of like everyone has an agenda about something, it's very clear where a lot of people only think of someone as a hero or a villain or good or bad. They only think of it that way because they're told to do so. Like, you know, someone's told this is bad and this is good, and they say, oh, okay, well, there you go. Without really trying to understand the full context of what each side or each part of the thing is. I feel like a lot of people, just in general, they only do or say things because they think that they're supposed to, rather than actually thinking that way. You know, because everyone thinks that they and their group are the heroes, the good guys. Because, I mean, everyone knows the full context of their own situation, right? Everyone knows where they come from, why they think that way, their own personal experience, everyone knows that. But then, hardly ever do they take the time to learn about why their opponent, or whatever, thinks the way they do. Like, take an argument in the supermarket, for example, right? Something really benign. But each side thinks that they're correct because they know the full context of why they got in that situation in the first place, but they have no idea why the other person did what they did. And so it's like, if you both think that you're the hero and the other person is the villain, then what does that even mean? Like, I mean, again, clearly there are some very clear-cut cases of villains and people who are good. But, you know, as we learn more and more about history, it's like, well, this person that did one good thing, their entire life was full of villainous acts, shall we say, but they did this one good thing in history, so we remember them for that thing, you know, or especially with celebrities now, it's like, this person's a really great person, but oh, turns out 30 years ago they weren't so great. So it's like, heroes and villains and right and wrong, it just shifts all the time. And so, is someone a villain because they do something bad, or are they a villain because we're told they are? And is that all they can ever be just because that's how we're told to see them? I don't know the answer, but it is something I think about more and more as you see on the news and on Facebook and Twitter and stuff. You see, you know, people arguing about these really just innocuous things, and how this really benign thing and everyone who thinks this really unimportant thing is just the worst person ever. I can't believe they would do that, you know? And so it just seems that with the times and with the sort of changing of the cultural zeitgeist or whatever, the idea of right and wrong and hero and villain can change drastically overnight sometimes. Anyway, those are just my thoughts on the situation. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe and like and all that stuff. And I'll see you all next week with a new video. Goodbye.